The dying sun cast long shadows across the parched Arizona territory as Catherine Foster stumbled forward, her cracked lips murmuring prayers that fell dead in the hot, still air. The small bundle clutched against her chest whimpered softly, the only sound besides her labored breathing and the crunch of sand beneath her blistered feet. 3 days without proper water, and the canteen swinging emptily at her hip served as a cruel reminder of how desperate their situation had become. "Just a little further, Emma," Catherine whispered to her 6-month-old daughter, whose flushed face peeked out from the worn blanket. "Mama's going to find us somewhere safe." Her husband's grave lay 2 days behind them, a crude wooden cross marking where Thomas Foster had succumbed to the fever that swept through their settlement near Tucson. With creditors claiming their modest ranch and nowhere else to turn, Catherine had gathered what little remained and set out for her cousin's homestead, rumored to be 3 days' journey northeast. But she had underestimated the brutality of the desert in August 1878, and now her daughter's life hung by an increasingly fragile thread. The distant silhouette of Mesa Rocks shimmered in the heat, seeming to drift further away with each step Catherine took. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges, and she stumbled, barely keeping herself from falling face first into the unforgiving earth. The baby began to cry in earnest now, a weak, thready sound that tore at Catherine's heart. "I know, sweet girl." "I know," she soothed, though her own throat was so parched the words emerged as barely more than a rasp. Just a little longer. She wasn't sure if she was lying to her daughter or herself. The truth was, Catherine had no idea how much further she could go. Her legs trembled beneath her, her dress clung to her sweat-soaked skin, and the world tilted dangerously as she forced herself to keep moving. The wind picked up suddenly, sending dust swirling around her in spirals. Catherine ducked her head, using her body to shield Emma from the stinging particles. When she looked up again, she thought her mind must be playing cruel tricks. There, not 50 yards ahead, was a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the crimson sky. Catherine tried to call out, but her voice failed her. She raised one arm weakly, stumbling faster, praying this apparition wouldn't vanish like so many other mirages had throughout the day. The horse and rider drew closer, and Catherine could make out the broad-brimmed hat, the sturdy frame, the concerned expression as the distance between them closed. Not a mirage, then. A man real and solid. "Madam," the voice was deep and cautious, "are you all right?" Catherine opened her mouth to respond, but the ground suddenly tilted beneath her feet. The last thing she remembered was strong arms catching her as darkness claimed her vision, and her precious bundle being carefully secured against a solid chest. When Catherine next opened her eyes, she was lying on something soft, a rough blanket covering her body. Her first panicked thought was for Emma, and she bolted upright with a hoarse cry. "Easy there," came that same deep voice she'd heard before losing consciousness. "Your little one's just fine." Catherine's gaze darted around what she now recognized as a modest cabin interior until it landed on a small wooden cradle near the fireplace. She could see Emma's tiny hand reaching upward, hear her cooing softly. She's all right," Catherine's voice cracked, her throat painfully dry. A tin cup of water appeared before her, held by a weathered hand. "Drink slow," the man advised. "Too much at once will make you sick." Catherine took the cup with trembling fingers, forcing herself to sip rather than gulp the precious liquid. As the water soothed her parched throat, she got her first clear look at her rescuer. He stood about 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered but lean, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. Dark hair curled from beneath his hat, and his eyes, a striking shade of blue, watched her with careful assessment. He wasn't young, but neither was he old. Catherine guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 5 years her senior. "Thank you," she managed after another careful sip. "You saved our lives." The man nodded once, then moved to check on Emma, adjusting the small blanket with surprisingly gentle hands for someone so obviously accustomed to physical labor. "Vince Farrell," he said simply, by way of introduction. "Most folks just call me Vince, Catherine Foster." "And that's Emma," She watched as he tended to her daughter with surprising competence. "My husband," her voice faltered. "We were heading north to my cousin's homestead when—" The words died in her throat. Vince didn't press for details. Instead, he moved to a small stove in the corner and ladled something from a pot into a bowl. "Been making some broth," he explained, bringing it to her. "Nothing fancy, but it'll help get your strength back." The simple kindness nearly undid her. Catherine accepted the bowl, blinking back tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for that," Vince replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Just rest up. You and the little one can stay here until you're fit to travel again." As Catherine sipped the warm broth, a simple beef stock with a few vegetables, she studied the cabin. It was small but clean, furnished with only the essentials. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed which she currently occupied, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and various tools of ranch life hanging from hooks on the walls. Through the single window, she could see the last light of day fading into purple dusk. "Where are we?" she asked. "My ranch, about 20 miles northeast of the old Spanish mission." Vince moved to add wood to the fire. "Not much, but it's shelter. Got a good well out back, never runs dry even in the worst summers. And you live here alone," a shadow passed briefly across his features. "Just me and the horses these days, been that way for a while now." There was a story there, Catherine sensed, but exhaustion was quickly reclaiming her. She finished the broth and Vince took the empty bowl. "You should sleep," he said. "Both of you need it." "But this is your bed. I've slept on worse than the floor plenty of times, madam," he interrupted. "Got my bedroll right over there." Too tired to argue, Catherine lay back down, her eyes drifting to where Emma now slept peacefully in the cradle. "Where did that come from?" she murmured, gesturing weakly toward it. A brief, almost imperceptible softening touched Vince's features. "Made it a while back, just something to do with my hands during the winter months." There was more to that explanation than he was sharing, but Catherine's eyelids grew heavy. The last thing she remembered before drifting into exhausted sleep was Vince carefully banking the fire for the night, his movements quiet and deliberate, as if trying not to disturb their rest. Catherine woke to the sound of Emma's hungry cries and the smell of coffee brewing. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the previous day's events came rushing back, the desperate journey, collapsing in the desert, being rescued by the taciturn rancher. She sat up quickly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and reached for Emma just as the cabin door opened. Vince entered, carrying a pail of fresh milk. "Thought you might need this," he said, nodding toward the crying infant. "Got a milk cow out back, figured little one might be hungry." Catherine gathered Emma into her arms, stunned by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Yes, thank you," she smoothed Emma's wispy hair. "I'd been giving her what little I could, but—" She trailed off, unwilling to admit how her own milk had nearly dried up from dehydration and lack of proper food. Vince turned away, giving her privacy as he busied himself preparing a bottle for the baby using a glass nursing bottle with a rubber nipple, clearly not something a bachelor rancher would typically have on hand. "You seem well prepared," Catherine observed carefully. His shoulders tensed slightly. "Neighbor's wife left some things behind when they moved on to California last year." He offered the prepared bottle. "Kept meaning to pass it along to someone who needed it." Catherine accepted it gratefully and began feeding Emma, who latched onto the nipple with desperate hunger. As her daughter's cries subsided into contented suckling sounds, Catherine took in more details of their rescuer in the clear morning light. Vince Farrell wore the practical clothing of a working rancher, sturdy trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and scuffed boots. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he'd once smiled more often than he did now. A thin scar traced from his left temple down to his jaw, long healed but still visible. "Thank you," Catherine said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "Not just for the milk, but for everything. We wouldn't have survived another day out there." Vince nodded once, then placed a mug of coffee and a plate with eggs and a thick slice of bread on the small table beside the bed. "Eat," he said simply. "Need to get your strength back." He moved toward the door, hat in hand. "You're leaving?" Catherine couldn't keep the note of alarm from her voice. "Got chores. Horses need tending, and the fence on the north pasture won't fix itself." He gestured to the cabin. "Make yourself at home. There's more food in the pantry and fresh water in the bucket by the stove. I'll be back by midday." After he'd gone, Catherine slowly rose from the bed, testing her legs. They were weak but steady enough. She carried Emma to the rocking chair and sat, continuing to feed her while examining their temporary sanctuary more thoroughly in daylight. The cabin was simple but solidly built, with signs of careful maintenance everywhere she looked. The floor was swept clean, the few dishes neatly stacked, the bed linens worn but freshly laundered. This was not the dwelling of a careless bachelor, but of a man who took pride in his surroundings, modest though they might be. On a shelf near the fireplace sat 3 books, a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare's works, and a dog-eared book on horse breeding. Beside them stood a small framed photograph, its silver frame polished despite the tarnish creeping in at the edges. Catherine resisted the urge to examine it more closely, feeling it would be an invasion of privacy. After finishing her breakfast and tending to Emma's needs, Catherine found she couldn't simply sit idle. Moving carefully around the cabin, she began to straighten up what little needed arranging, then mixed together ingredients she found in the pantry for a simple stew. It was the least she could do to repay Vince's kindness. As she worked, Catherine found herself wondering about the solitary rancher. What had brought him to this remote stretch of territory? Why did he live alone, with a cradle he'd made to keep his hands busy and baby items from neighbors who'd moved on? The questions circled in her mind, but she pushed them aside. His story was his own to share or keep. By midday, the stew was simmering on the stove, filling the cabin with a savory aroma. Emma, fed and changed, dozed contentedly in her cradle. Catherine had just finished hanging out a few of their freshly washed garments on a line behind the cabin when she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Vince dismounted from his chestnut, gelding with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing hair damp with sweat from his morning's labor. "You didn't need to do all this," he said, gesturing toward the washing line and noticing the smell of cooking food wafting from the cabin. "It's nothing compared to what you've done for us," Catherine replied. "Besides, I've never been one to sit idle." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Neither was he stopped abruptly. "I mean, that's a good quality." They ate lunch together in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable, 2 strangers brought together by circumstance, each cautiously assessing the other. Emma slept peacefully, occasionally making soft sounds that drew Vince's gaze, something like longing flashing briefly in his eyes before he masked it. "Your cousin's place," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Where exactly were you heading?" Catherine's hands stilled on her spoon. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "I received a letter about 6 months ago, just before Emma was born. She wrote that they'd settled somewhere north of Tucson, near the river." She swallowed hard. "It was the only place I could think to go after Thomas after my husband passed and the bank took our place." Vince considered this, his expression grave. "There's a few homesteads that way, but travel's not safe for a woman alone with a baby, not with the way things are out here." "I know that now," Catherine said quietly. "I was desperate," he nodded, understanding without judgment. "When you're feeling stronger, I can make some inquiries in town. Maybe someone knows your cousin's family." "That would be very kind." Vince stood, placing his bowl in the wash basin. "In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here. Got the room, and it'd be nice to have someone make use of that cradle." There it was again, that fleeting shadow across his features, a wound still raw beneath the surface of his composed exterior. "I don't want to impose," Catherine began. "You're not imposing if you're invited," he replied firmly. "Besides, little one needs a safe place to grow stronger before any more traveling." Over the next few days, they settled into an unexpected rhythm. Vince would rise before dawn, tend to the most pressing ranch chores, then return for breakfast that Catherine prepared. After eating, he'd return to his work while Catherine cared for Emma, kept the cabin in order, and prepared meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking quietly, other times simply existing in companionable silence. Catherine learned that Vince had come to the Arizona Territory 10 years earlier, drawn by the promise of open land and a fresh start after the war. He'd fought for the Union, though he spoke little of those years. He'd built the ranch from nothing, starting with just 2 horses and gradually expanding to his current operation of 24 quality animals, mainly quarter horses bred for ranch work. With a few thoroughbreds he was training for racing. What he didn't speak of was family, or his life before the war, or why a man clearly competent and resourceful remained alone in this harsh country. Catherine didn't press. She had her own grief, still raw and bleeding beneath the surface of daily survival. On the 5th day, Emma developed a slight fever. It wasn't serious, but enough to send a spike of fear through Catherine's heart, memories of Thomas's rapid decline still hauntingly fresh. Vince found her pacing the cabin floor near midnight, Emma fussing in her arms despite all attempts to soothe her. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert. "She's warm," Catherine said, her voice tight with worry, not dangerously so, but without hesitation, Vince reached for his coat. "There's a doctor in town, I'll fetch him." "Town is nearly 15 miles away," Catherine protested, "and it's the middle of the night." "Won't be the first time Doc Wilson's been woken for less," Vince replied, already heading for the door. "Keep her cool with damp cloths." "I'll be back before dawn." True to his word, Vince returned just as the eastern sky began to lighten, the doctor riding alongside him. Doctor Wilson was an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands who examined Emma thoroughly before pronouncing her suffering from nothing more serious than a mild summer fever. "Keep her cool, make sure she takes plenty of fluids, and she'll be right as rain in a day or two," he assured Catherine, who nearly collapsed with relief. As the doctor packed his bag, he cast a curious glance between Catherine and Vince. "Didn't know you had company, Farrell." "Been keeping to yourself even more than usual these past months. Mrs. Foster and her daughter needed assistance," Vince replied stiffly, just being neighborly. Dr. Wilson's expression softened with understanding. "Of course," he turned to Catherine. "You're in good hands, madam. Farrell here is one of the finest men in the territory, though he'd never admit to it." After the doctor left, Catherine found Vince outside, unsaddling his horse. His shoulders were slumped with exhaustion from the overnight ride. "You should rest," she said softly. He shook his head. "Got too much to do. The horses can wait a few hours," Catherine interrupted gently. "You've ridden 30 miles through the night, please." Something in her tone must have reached him because Vince nodded reluctantly. "Maybe for an hour or two." He slept for 6, sprawled on his bedroll near the fireplace, while Catherine watched over Emma, whose fever had already begun to subside with the medicine Dr. Wilson had provided. As she observed Vince's sleeping form, Catherine was struck by how much younger he looked in repose. The lines of worry and reserve smoothed away. When he finally woke, there was a moment of disorientation in his eyes, quickly replaced by concern as he sat up. "Emma." "Much better," Catherine assured him. "Her fever's nearly gone." Relief washed over his features. "Good, that's good." Catherine hesitated, then spoke the words that had been turning over in her mind for hours. "Why did you do it? Ride all that way in the dark for a child you barely know?" Vince looked away, his jaw tightening. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Had a daughter once, and a wife." The words seemed dragged from somewhere deep and painful. "Lost them both to fever 3 years ago. Sarah, my wife, went first, then Lily just 2 years old a week later." He swallowed hard. Couldn't do anything but watch them slip away. Catherine's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, made that cradle for Lily when Sarah was carrying her," he continued, still not meeting Catherine's eyes. "Couldn't bring myself to get rid of it after, just couldn't." "That's why you stopped when you saw us in the desert," Catherine realized. "A woman with a baby, Vince nodded once sharply. Couldn't ride past, not again. The simple admission hung in the air between them, a moment of raw vulnerability from a man who clearly guarded his emotions carefully. Catherine reached out, placing her hand lightly on his forearm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." His eyes met hers briefly, blue and intense with emotions too complex to name, before he stood and moved away, the moment broken. "Should check on the horses," he murmured, and was gone. That evening something had shifted between them. The careful distance Vince had maintained seemed to have diminished, not dramatically but noticeably. He asked more questions about Catherine's life before her childhood in Missouri, her marriage to Thomas, their dreams of building something in the West that had been cut tragically short. "Thomas was a good man," Catherine said softly, rocking Emma as they sat by the fire. "Not perfect, he could be stubborn as a mule and had grand ideas that sometimes outpaced his abilities, but he was kind. He would have been a wonderful father." "How did you meet?" Vince asked. Catherine smiled at the memory. "At a church social. I was 17, he was 22 and just back from working on the railroads. Said he knew the moment he saw me that I'd be his wife someday." Her smile faded slightly. "We had 5 good years together, not enough, but I'm grateful for them." 5 years can hold a lifetime," Vince agreed, his gaze distant. "Sarah and I had 7, seemed like forever and no time at all looking back." "How did you meet her?" A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "She threw a bucket of water on me." Catherine's eyebrows rose. "That's an unusual introduction." "I deserved it," Vince admitted. "I was young and full of myself after coming back from the war, said something foolish to her outside her father's general store, and she didn't hesitate to cool me down." His smile widened at the memory. "Knew right then she was special. Took me 6 months to convince her I wasn't completely worthless." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of the people they'd loved and lost. It was painful but somehow healing. These shared confidences between two people who understood the particular weight of grief that came from burying a spouse too soon. As the days passed and stretched into weeks, Emma grew stronger, her cheeks filling out and her smile appearing just recently lighting up the cabin. Catherine knew she should be making plans to move on, to find her cousin or perhaps make her way to one of the larger towns where she might find work. But each time she considered it, something held her back. It wasn't just practical considerations, though those were significant. A woman alone with a small child had few options in the territories, especially with winter approaching. But more than that, Catherine found herself reluctant to leave the quiet routine they had established, the sense of safety and belonging that had begun to take root. And there was Vince. She watched him with Emma, the gentle way he held her, the soft words he murmured when he thought Catherine couldn't hear, the genuine delight that transformed his face when Emma grasped his finger in her tiny hand. Catherine saw how the shadows in his eyes seemed lighter with each passing day, how he lingered longer at mealtimes, finding reasons to remain in the cabin rather than return immediately to his work. One evening in late September, nearly a month after he'd found them in the desert, Vince returned from town with news. "Found your cousin," he said without preamble. "Or at least I think it's her. Nancy Baker. Husband's name is William." Catherine's heart leaped. "Yes, that's them." "Where are they?" "Settled about 40 miles north near the crossing at Silver Creek." Vince's expression was carefully neutral. "It's a good area, fertile land, decent water. They're doing well by all accounts." "That's wonderful news," Catherine said, though her enthusiasm felt oddly hollow. "I should write to her immediately, let her know we're coming." Vince nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Of course, I can take you there once you're ready. 2 days' ride, maybe 3 with the little one." The thought of leaving brought an unexpected ache to Catherine's chest. She looked around the cabin that had become home over the past weeks, at Emma's cradle near the fire, at the small touches she'd added to make the space more comfortable, at the man standing before her with his guarded expression and kind eyes. "There's no rush," she said carefully. "Winter will be here soon. Might be better to wait until spring for such a journey." Vince looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since entering the cabin. You'd want to stay that long if we're not imposing, Catherine said, her heart beating faster. You could never impose, he replied softly. This place hasn't felt like a home since. He swallowed. It's better with you both here. The admission hung between them, simple but profound. Catherine took a step closer to him. Then we'll stay at least until spring. By then, Emma will be stronger for traveling. Relief washed over Vince's features and something else, hope, perhaps, carefully contained but undeniably present. I'd like that, he said. That night, after Emma had been put to bed in her cradle, Catherine and Vince sat together on the small porch Vince had built onto the front of the cabin. The autumn air carried a hint of coolness, a welcome change from summer's relentless heat. Stars crowded the vast sky overhead, impossibly bright and numerous. I never saw stars like this back in Missouri, Catherine remarked, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. One of the reasons I stayed, Vince admitted. First night in the territory, I looked up and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Felt like I could reach up and touch them. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft chirp of crickets. Catherine was acutely aware of Vince beside her, of the space between them on the rough-hewn bench not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. When Thomas died, she said suddenly, I thought that was the end of everything. All our plans, all our dreams gone in an instant. I couldn't imagine ever feeling anything but grief and fear again. Vince turned to look at her, his expression attentive but patient, allowing her to continue at her own pace. But these past weeks... Catherine took a deep breath. I've started to feel something like hope again, like maybe there's still a future worth moving toward. There is, Vince said quietly, for you and for Emma. You're strong, Catherine, stronger than you know. So are you, she replied. To lose what you did and still find the courage to keep going to build this place to help strangers in need. She hesitated, then reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. I'm glad you found us that day. Vince's hand turned beneath hers, his calloused fingers entwining with her own. So am I, he whispered. They didn't speak again for some time, content to sit beneath the canopy of stars with their hands joined, each lost in their own thoughts yet somehow more together than apart. The next morning brought a change in the air, the first real hint of autumn's approach. Vince announced at breakfast that he needed to begin preparations for winter, which meant a trip into town for supplies that would take him away overnight. I won't be gone long, he assured Catherine. Just need to stock up before the weather turns. We get cut off sometimes when the rains come. The "we" didn't escape Catherine's notice, nor the way it made something warm unfurl in her chest. We'll be fine for a day, she replied. Emma and I can manage. Vince seemed reluctant to leave despite his stated intentions, finding small tasks around the cabin that suddenly needed his attention. Finally, with the sun already high in the sky, he saddled his horse and loaded a pack mule with empty sacks for the supplies he would purchase. If anyone comes by, which isn't likely, just don't open the door, he instructed, handing Catherine a rifle. You know how to use this, she nodded. Growing up on a farm and then living on a remote ranch with Thomas had made such knowledge necessary. I can protect us if needed, but I doubt it will be. Still, better safe than sorry. Vince adjusted his hat, checked his saddlebags one final time, then hesitated. Catherine, he trailed off, seeming to search for words. Yes, she prompted gently. Instead of speaking, he stepped forward and, with a gentleness that belied his strength, cupped her face in one hand. His calloused thumb brushed her cheek in a touch so tender it made her breath catch. For a heartbeat, Catherine thought he might kiss her, wanted him to, with a sudden intensity that surprised her, but he merely gazed at her as if committing her features to memory. I'll be back tomorrow, he said finally, his voice rough with emotions left unspoken. Then he was gone, mounting his horse in one fluid motion and riding away without looking back, the pack mule trailing obediently behind. Catherine stood watching until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. It had been so long since she'd felt this particular mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, not since the early days with Thomas, when every glance and touch had carried the thrill of new possibility. The thought brought a pang of guilt. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man? Thomas had been gone less than 3 months. The wound of his loss was still fresh, the grief still a daily companion. Yet as Catherine turned back to the cabin, to Emma awake and gurgling in her cradle, to the home she had helped create within these simple walls, she felt Thomas would understand. He had always told her that life was for the living, that love was meant to be given freely. "If anything happens to me," he'd said once during a particularly harsh winter when illness had swept through their settlement, "don't waste away in mourning, find happiness again." At the time, she'd hushed him, unwilling to contemplate such a possibility. Now, she wondered if he'd somehow sensed that their time together would be brief, if he'd been trying to give her permission for exactly this moment. The day passed slowly without Vince's presence. Catherine tended to Emma, prepared meals from their dwindling stores, and worked on mending some of Vince's shirts that she'd noticed needed attention. As evening approached, she found herself repeatedly glancing toward the window, listening for hoofbeats that wouldn't come until the following day. Night fell, and Catherine secured the cabin, checking the bar across the door and placing the rifle within easy reach as Vince had instructed. She settled Emma in her cradle, then prepared for bed herself, extinguishing all but one small lamp that cast long shadows across the cabin's interior. Sleep proved elusive. Catherine lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the trees surrounding the homestead, the occasional soft sounds from Emma's cradle. Without Vince's steady presence nearby, the cabin felt different, emptier somehow despite its small size. Catherine had just begun to drift toward sleep when a sound jolted her fully awake, the unmistakable approach of horses, moving at speed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped from the bed, quickly checking on Emma before moving to the window. Through the darkness, she could make out 3 riders approaching the cabin, their figures illuminated by moonlight. They weren't moving with the caution of travelers seeking shelter, but with the purposeful haste of men with specific intent. Catherine's mouth went dry. She reached for the rifle, checking that it was loaded as she had earlier. Keeping away from the windows, she positioned herself between the door and Emma's cradle, the weapon held ready. The riders pulled up outside, their voices carrying clearly through the night air. "This is Farrell's place, all right," one said. "Lights still on inside." "Heard in town he's gone till tomorrow," another replied. "Just a woman and baby here, easy pickings." "Boss said clean it out and burn it," said a third voice, deeper than the others. "Teach Farrell what happens when you cross the Harker outfit." Catherine's blood ran cold. She'd heard of the Harkers, a family that controlled much of the cattle trade in the northern part of the territory through intimidation and violence. What had Vince done to earn their enmity? The sound of boots on the porch steps galvanized Catherine into action. "I'm armed," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "This property is defended." A moment of silence, then harsh laughter. "Hear that, boys? The little lady's gonna defend herself." More laughter. "Listen, madam, we don't want to hurt you or the baby. Just step aside and let us do our business with Farrell's place." "My husband will be back any minute," Catherine lied, hoping to deter them. "He and his men rode out to check on a disturbance at the north fence." "Nice try," called the deep voice, "but we know Farrell's in town. And he ain't your husband, unless things changed mighty quick since his wife died." The door shuddered as someone threw their weight against it. The bar held, but Catherine knew it wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. Emma woke at the noise, her cries adding to the chaos. Catherine's mind raced. The cabin had no back door, no escape route. She was trapped with her child, facing men who clearly meant harm. The door shuddered again, the wood splintering slightly. One more good push and they'd be inside. A shot rang out, not from Catherine's rifle but from somewhere outside, then another. Shouts of confusion and alarm followed. "It's Farrell," one of the men yelled. "That's impossible." Another shot cut off the protest, the sound of scrambling, of men rushing back to their horses. Hoofbeats thundered away from the cabin, fading rapidly into the night. "Catherine," Vince's voice urgent with concern. "Catherine, are you all right?" Relief flooded through her as she rushed to unbar the door. Vince stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his expression a mixture of fury and fear. "We're fine," she assured him, even as she sagged against him, the rifle slipping from her grasp. "How did you know?" Vince's arms came around her, solid and secure. "Ran into Jeff Wilson in town, Doc's son. He'd overheard some of Harker's men talking about paying me a visit while I was away." His voice tightened. "Rode back as fast as I could if anything had happened to you or Emma." "But it didn't," Catherine said, drawing back to look up at him. "You came back in time." Emma's cries grew more insistent. Catherine reluctantly pulled away to go to her daughter, lifting her from the cradle and soothing her with gentle words and rocking motions. Vince secured the door, then checked the windows before setting his rifle aside. His movements were controlled, but Catherine could see the tension radiating from him, the barely contained fury at the threat to those under his protection. "The Harkers," Catherine said as Emma's cries subsided to whimpers. "What quarrel do they have with you?" Vince's jaw tightened. "Their outfit's been trying to push smaller ranchers out for years, take over the whole valley. I've been organizing resistance, helping folks stand together against their tactics." He ran a hand through his hair, disheveled from his hard ride. "They burned out the Millers last month. Would have done the same to the Hendersons if we hadn't stepped in. That's why the doctor called you one of the finest men in the territory," Catherine realized. Vince looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needs doing," he muttered, "but I never thought they'd come here. Not with you and Emma." He broke off, his expression haunted. "I put you in danger, both of you." "No," Catherine said firmly. "Those men put us in danger, you protected us." "I should have been here," Vince insisted, self-recrimination clear in his voice. "Never should have left you alone." "You came back when it mattered," Catherine countered. She moved toward him, Emma now calm in her arms. "Vince, look at me." Reluctantly, he met her gaze. "You can't be everywhere at once," she said softly, "and you can't stop fighting for what's right just because there's risk involved. That's not who you are." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, at being seen so clearly. "Catherine," whatever he might have said was interrupted by Emma, who chose that moment to reach out toward Vince with a happy gurgle, clearly recognizing and wanting him despite the earlier disturbance. The tension in Vince's face softened as he carefully took the baby from Catherine's arms. "Hello there, little one," he murmured. "Did those bad men scare you? They're gone now. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm around." Watching him with Emma, Catherine felt something settle within her, a certainty that had been gradually building over the weeks, but crystallized in this moment of crisis. This man, with his quiet strength and gentle heart, had become essential to her in a way she hadn't thought possible again. The realization must have shown on her face, because when Vince looked up from Emma, his eyes widened slightly. "Catherine," she stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. With Emma cradled securely in one of Vince's arms, Catherine reached up and laid her palm against his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "I'm glad you came back," she whispered. "Not just tonight, but every day, I'm glad you're here." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a tentative hope so vulnerable it made her heart ache. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Vince leaned down until his forehead rested against hers. "I'll always come back to you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you." The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle, a question more than a demand, a promise tentatively offered. Catherine answered with her own certainty, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck, drawing him closer as something long dormant within her bloomed back to life. They broke apart at Emma's insistent patting of Vince's chin, her baby giggles a reminder of her presence between them. Vince laughed softly, the sound warming Catherine from within. "Think she's giving her approval?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "I think she's been yours since the moment you found us," Catherine replied honestly. "As have I, though it took me longer to realize it." The morning brought not only sunshine but a new sense of possibility as Catherine and Vince moved around each other in the small cabin, preparing for the day. Each glance, each casual touch now carried added meaning, acknowledgement of feelings no longer hidden, of a future they might build together. "I still need to get those supplies from town," Vince said as they finished breakfast. "Can't put it off with winter coming on." "We'll be fine," Catherine assured him. "After last night, I doubt those men will return so soon." Still, Vince hesitated. "I'd feel better if you weren't alone." An idea occurred to Catherine. "What if we all went? Emma and I could use a trip beyond these four walls, and I'd like to see the town you've told me about." The suggestion clearly surprised him. "It's not much of a place, just a general store, the doctor's house, a saloon, and a few other buildings, hardly worth the journey." "It would be to us," Catherine replied. "We've been nowhere but here since you found us, and if we're to stay through winter, I should know where the nearest settlement is." The words "if we're to stay" hung between them, a reminder that nothing had yet been decided beyond the immediate future. Catherine saw the flicker of uncertainty in Vince's eyes, the careful hope he still guarded closely. "All right," he agreed finally. "We'll make a day of it. The wagon will be more comfortable for you and Emma than riding horseback." 2 hours later, they set out in Vince's sturdy wagon, Emma securely nestled between them. The morning air held that peculiar clarity unique to autumn in the high desert, the sky an impossible blue overhead. Catherine breathed deeply, enjoying the sensation of movement after weeks of relative confinement. The journey to town took most of the morning, with Vince pointing out landmarks along the way, the ridge where he'd first spotted Catherine and Emma in the desert, the creek that ran year-round even in drought years, the distant mountains that would soon be capped with snow. "That's why we need to prepare now," he explained. "Once those peaks turn white, the weather can change fast. Roads get washed out, and sometimes we're snowed in for weeks." "Weeks?" Catherine asked, a note of concern in her voice. "What if someone falls ill or there's an emergency?" "We look out for each other," Vince replied. "Every ranch keeps basic medical supplies, and most of us know enough to handle common ailments. For serious matters," he shrugged, "you pray and do the best you can." The reality of frontier life, its isolation and self-reliance, was nothing new to Catherine, yet somehow the stakes felt higher now. It wasn't just herself she had to consider, but Emma's welfare. And now, increasingly, a future that might include Vince. The town, when they finally reached it, was indeed small, a single dusty main street lined with wooden buildings in various states of repair. Several horses were hitched outside what appeared to be the saloon, and a few people moved about their business, nodding in greeting as Vince guided the wagon toward the general store. Farrell, a portly man in a stained apron, emerged from the store as they pulled up. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon after yesterday." His curious gaze fell on Catherine and Emma, and with company no less. "Morning, Jenkins," Vince replied, helping Catherine down from the wagon. "This is Mrs. Foster and her daughter, Emma. They're staying at my place for a while." Jenkins's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Madam, little miss." He turned back to Vince. "Harker's boys were in town this morning, looking worse for wear, nursing some wounds from the looks of it." A muscle twitched in Vince's jaw. "Is that so?" "Talk is they ran into some trouble last night, something about a job gone wrong." Jenkins gave Vince a significant look. "Thought you might want to know they're still around." "Appreciate the warning," Vince said, his hand moving protectively to Catherine's lower back. "We'll just get our supplies and be on our way." Inside the store, Catherine was struck by the variety of goods available despite the town's small size. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from basic foodstuffs to tools, fabric, ammunition, and even a small selection of books and paper goods. While Vince discussed his order with Jenkins, Catherine browsed the shelves, Emma contently observing from her arms. She paused at a display of fabric, running her fingers over a bolt of soft blue cotton. "Would make a fine dress," came a woman's voice from behind her. Catherine turned to find an older woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair watching her. "It's lovely," she agreed. "But I'm afraid it's not in my budget at present," the woman smiled. "I'm Martha Wilson, the doctor's wife, and you must be the young woman Vince Farrell rescued from the desert. My husband told me about you and your little girl." Catherine Foster, Catherine introduced herself. And yes, Mr. Farrell has been very kind to us. Martha's smile deepened. Just Vince now, is it? And kind seems a modest description for a man who rides through the night to fetch a doctor for your baby, then brings you to town on supply day. Heat rose in Catherine's cheeks. News traveled quickly in small communities, and it seemed their situation had become a subject of interest. Don't fret, dear, Martha continued, correctly interpreting Catherine's discomfort. No one here would think ill of you, quite the opposite. It's been 3 years since Sarah and little Lily passed, and many of us feared Vince would never emerge from his grief, seeing him with you and your daughter. She patted Catherine's hand. It does an old woman's heart good. Before Catherine could respond, Vince appeared at her side, having concluded his business with Jenkins. Mrs. Wilson, he greeted, tipping his hat. Giving Catherine the town gossip already, just making her feel welcome, Martha replied with an unrepentant smile. You should bring them to Sunday dinner, Vince. Doc would love to see how the little one is thriving. To Catherine's surprise, Vince nodded. We'll consider it, madam. Thank you for the invitation. Outside, as Jenkins and his assistant loaded their supplies into the wagon, Catherine noticed a group of men watching them from across the street. Their expressions were far from friendly, and a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow made a gesture that was unmistakably threatening. Vince, she murmured, nodding slightly in their direction, his expression hardened as he followed her gaze. Harker's men, he confirmed quietly. Stay close to me. The men made no move to approach, but their hostile stares followed as Vince helped Catherine and Emma back into the wagon. Only when they were clear of the town did Catherine feel the tension leave her shoulders. Will there be trouble? She asked, knowing the answer even as she spoke the words. Vince's hands tightened on the reins. There already is trouble, he said grimly. Has been for months. But it's coming to a head now, because of us. The thought that she and Emma might have accelerated a conflict was distressing. No, Vince assured her. This was brewing long before you arrived. Harker's been pushing harder lately, getting more aggressive. Sooner or later, there'll be a reckoning. The words hung heavy between them as they continued their journey home. Catherine found herself studying the countryside with new eyes, no longer seeing just its beauty, but also its isolation, how vulnerable they were out here, how dependent on themselves and each other for survival. Back at the cabin, as they unloaded supplies and settled in for the evening, Catherine's mind continued to work through the implications of what she'd learned. The Harkers posed a real threat, not just to Vince, but to everyone who stood against their expansion. And now, by association, to her and Emma as well. You're worried, Vince observed after Emma had been put to bed and they sat together by the fire. Catherine didn't deny it. I'm trying to understand what we're facing, she replied. These men, the Harkers, they're not just rustlers or bullies, are they? No, Vince admitted. Old man Harker came out here just after the war with his 3 sons. Started with a small spread, but they've been expanding ever since, taking over properties through intimidation, threats, sometimes violence. They want to control all the water rights in the valley, all the best grazing land. And you've been organizing resistance, Vince nodded. Someone had to. The law's too far away and spread too thin to help much. The territorial marshal makes it out here maybe twice a year. Have they hurt people, killed them? Catherine needed to know the full extent of the danger. Vince was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. There have been accidents, he said finally. Fires, stampedes, people getting hurt in ways that can't quite be proven deliberate. And yes, a few deaths that never got properly investigated. Catherine absorbed this, her heart heavy but her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. What are you planning to do? Keep fighting, Vince replied simply. Keep helping others stand their ground. Eventually, either the law will catch up to the Harkers or enough people will stand together that they'll be forced to back down. And if neither of those things happens? The question hung between them, unanswered but acknowledged. Their future balanced on uncertainties too numerous to count. Catherine, Vince reached for her hand, his expression serious. I want you to know that if you decide this is too dangerous, if you want to continue on to your cousin's place, I'll understand. I'll take you there myself when the weather allows." The offer was sincere. She knew a chance to step away from a fight that wasn't hers, to choose safety for herself and her child. But even as Vince spoke the words, Catherine recognized the truth that had been growing within her heart. "This is our home now," she said quietly, squeezing his hand. "Emma's and mine, here with you. Whatever comes, we face it together." The relief and love that flooded Vince's expression made Catherine's breath catch. He drew her closer, his arms encircling her with gentle strength. "Together," he echoed, the word a promise against her hair. "I never thought I'd have this again, someone to build a life with, a family to protect. After Sarah and Lily, I was just existing, going through the motions." "I know," Catherine whispered. "After Thomas, I felt the same, empty, lost." "Not anymore," Vince said, drawing back to look into her eyes. "I can't promise it will be easy, Catherine. This life, it's hard in the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. But I swear to you, I'll do everything in my power to keep you and Emma safe, to make a good life for all of us." "That's all anyone can ask," Catherine replied, "and I promise the same to you." The kiss they shared was deeper than before, filled with newfound certainty and shared purpose. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them not as separate individuals bearing their own burdens of grief and responsibility, but as something new and stronger, a family forged from loss but reaching toward hope. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of domestic harmony and cautious vigilance. Vince continued his work on the ranch, preparing for winter with Catherine's help. Together they repaired fences, stored hay for the horses, smoked meat, and preserved fruits and vegetables from the small garden behind the cabin. Emma thrived in her new home, growing stronger and more alert each day. She began to pull herself up, determined to stand, though still too young to manage it for more than a moment. Her first clear word, "Ma Ma," reduced Catherine to tears of joy, while her second, a distinct "Vin," that couldn't be mistaken for anything else, brought such a look of wonder to Vince's face that Catherine felt her heart might burst with love for them both. They attended Sunday dinner at the Wilsons' as invited, where Catherine was introduced to other families from the surrounding area. The welcome was warm, with no one commenting directly on the nature of her and Vince's relationship, though knowing glances were exchanged among the older women when Vince unconsciously placed his hand at the small of Catherine's back, or when Emma reached for him with complete trust. "You've brought him back to life," Martha Wilson confided to Catherine as they washed dishes after the meal. "We've all been watching him fade away these past years, throwing himself into dangerous situations like he didn't much care if he came back from them." Catherine glanced through the doorway to where Vince sat with the other men, Emma bouncing on his knee as he discussed ranch matters. "He saved us," she said softly. "I'm not sure who brought whom back to life." "That's how it should be," Martha replied with a satisfied nod. "Two people healing each other." The threat from the Harkers remained, hovering at the edges of their newfound happiness. Twice more riders were spotted near the boundaries of Vince's property, though they didn't approach the cabin directly. Vince began carrying his rifle whenever he worked the outer sections of the ranch, and he taught Catherine to use the shotgun as well as the rifle, insisting she keep one within reach at all times. "Just in case," he said, though they both knew it was more than a precaution. October gave way to November, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that transformed the desert landscape. The mountains to the north wore a dusting of white on their highest peaks, a warning of the winter to come. It was during one such rainstorm, with water drumming steadily on the cabin's roof and the world outside reduced to gray sheets of falling water, that Vince asked Catherine to marry him. They had just put Emma to bed after a long day of indoor activities, Catherine teaching Vince to make proper biscuits, Vince showing Catherine how to repair tack, both of them taking turns entertaining Emma, who grew fussier than usual with the confinement of the rainy day. As they sat before the fire, Vince suddenly rose and moved to a small trunk in the corner. He returned with a simple wooden box which he placed in Catherine's hands. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "It was my mother's." Catherine opened the box to find a ring inside a simple gold band with a small pearl set into it, nothing ostentatious but clearly precious. "It's beautiful," she breathed, looking up at him with questioning eyes. Vince knelt before her, taking her free hand in both of his. "Catherine Foster, I know it hasn't been long, and I know we both carry grief that may never fully leave us. But these past months with you and Emma have brought me back to life. I love you both of you more than I thought possible after losing Sarah and Lily." He swallowed hard. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, let me be a father to Emma, build a life together here." Tears blurred Catherine's vision as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Vince gently took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger, where it fit as if made for her. "Yes," she managed finally. "Yes, Vince, I'll marry you." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I'll spend every day making sure you never regret that decision," he promised. They were married 2 weeks later in the Wilsons' parlor, with Dr. Wilson officiating in his capacity as Justice of the Peace. Martha stood as witness for Catherine, while Jeff Wilson stood for Vince. Emma, dressed in a new gown made from that blue fabric Catherine had admired in the store, Martha's wedding gift, was passed among the small gathering of friends who attended the simple ceremony. The words they spoke were traditional, but the emotions behind them were anything but ordinary. Two people who had known profound loss finding unexpected joy in each other, pledging to build a future neither had imagined possible mere months before. As Catherine repeated her vows, she thought of Thomas not with guilt, but with a sense of peaceful acknowledgement. He would be glad, she knew, to see her and Emma safe and loved. Similarly, she sensed that Vince carried Sarah and Lily with him not as barriers to new love, but as parts of the man he had become, the man she now took as her husband. The winter that followed their wedding was harsh but beautiful. Snow fell heavily in December, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse that glittered blindingly in the sun. The cabin, once merely functional in Catherine's eyes, became a haven of warmth and love, small but sufficient for their family of 3. They established new traditions together. Reading aloud by the fire in the evenings, Sunday mornings spent luxuriating in bed while Emma babbled happily in her cradle, special meals to mark the passing of weeks and months. Catherine hung curtains she had sewn from fabric purchased in town, arranged wildflowers in jars when they were available, and added small touches that transformed the bachelor's cabin into a family home. Vince watched these changes with evident pleasure, sometimes catching Catherine in the middle of some domestic task just to hold her, to press his lips to her temple or the curve of her neck. "I never thought I'd have this again," he would murmur, words that never lost their wonder no matter how often he repeated them. The threat from the Harkers receded during the worst of the winter months, when deep snow and freezing temperatures made travel difficult for everyone in the territory. But as February turned to March and the first signs of thaw appeared, tension returned to Vince's shoulders when he rode the boundaries of their property. "They'll be back," he said grimly one evening as they prepared for bed. "Once the pass is clear and the roads are passable again." Catherine, brushing out her hair before the small mirror Vince had mounted on the wall for her, met his eyes in the reflection. "What will you do?" Vince sat on the edge of their bed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as a sign of his worry. "The ranchers in the valley have been talking, sending messages when weather permits. We're thinking of forming an official association, strength in numbers, legal standing to counter the Harkers' claims." "Will it be enough?" Catherine asked, setting down her brush and moving to sit beside him. "I don't know," Vince admitted, "but it's a start. And there's word the territorial governor is sending a federal marshal out this way come spring, someone with real authority to investigate complaints." Catherine laid her head on his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Then we have hope, we do." Vince turned to press a kiss to her forehead. "And no matter what, Catherine, I swear to you our family will be safe. I won't let anything happen to you or Emma." She believed him not because she thought him invincible or because she underestimated the Harkers' threat, but because she knew the depth of his commitment, the strength of his love. Vince Farrell was a man who kept his promises, who had already proven his willingness to risk everything to protect those who depended on him. As winter reluctantly released its grip on the land, Emma celebrated her first birthday. The actual date was a best guess, as Catherine had lost track of exact days during their ordeal in the desert, but they chose a Sunday in early April when the first wildflowers had begun to appear on the hillsides. Martha and Dr. Wilson came for dinner, bringing a small wooden toy horse that Jeff had carved for Emma. The celebration was simple but joyful, with Emma presiding from her high chair, another of Vince's creations smearing cake on her face and giggling at the adults' antics. Later, after their guests had departed and Emma slept soundly in the cradle she was rapidly outgrowing, Vince presented Catherine with a surprise of her own. "Been working on this when you weren't looking," he said, bringing out a carefully wrapped package from its hiding place beneath their bed. Inside, Catherine found a small framed portrait, a photograph taken during their visit to town the previous week. The photographer, passing through on his way to California, had set up his equipment in the churchyard, and Vince had insisted on having a family portrait made, though the expense was considerable. There they were, preserved in sepia tones. Vince standing straight and proud, Catherine seated before him with Emma on her lap, all three looking toward the camera with expressions of quiet happiness. It wasn't a perfect image. Emma had been fidgeting, and the bright sun had made Catherine squint slightly, but it captured something essential about them. A family forged from unlikely circumstances, but no less real for that. "It's perfect," Catherine whispered, tracing the outline of their faces through the glass. "Our family," Vince nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "To remember this time," he said softly, "no matter what comes next." What came next was the long-anticipated confrontation with the Harker family, though not in the form anyone had expected. Spring had fully established itself, with wildflowers carpeting the hills and new growth turning the landscape green after winter's dormancy. Vince and the other ranchers had formalized their association, with Dr. Wilson acting as their legal representative in communications with territorial authorities. The promised federal marshal had arrived astern, no-nonsense man named Crawford who took statements from various ranchers about the Harkers' activities over the past years. The Harkers themselves had been uncharacteristically quiet, leading some to hope they might have recognized the changing tide and decided to operate within the law going forward. "Don't count on it," Vince cautioned when this theory was proposed during a meeting at the Jenkins store. "They're planning something, I can feel it." His instincts proved correct, though the form of the Harkers' retaliation came from an unexpected direction. It began with a letter delivered by a passing trader, an official-looking document from the Territorial Land Office questioning the validity of Vince's claim to his ranch. "This is nonsense," Vince said, scanning the letter with growing anger. "My paperwork is in order. I've held this land legally for 10 years. But the letter claimed discrepancies in the original filing, suggesting that the boundaries of Vince's property might overlap with land already claimed by predictably Harker Holdings, Inc. "They're trying a new approach," Catherine realized, reading over Vince's shoulder. "If intimidation won't work, they'll try legal means to push you out. They won't succeed," Vince said grimly. "My claim is solid." Yet the letter was just the beginning. Within days, similar notices were received by 3 other ranchers in the valley, all key members of the newly formed association, all with properties strategically located along critical water sources. "It's a coordinated attack," Jeff Wilson explained when he rode out to the Farrells' ranch with news from town. "Father's been going through the records. The Harkers filed a series of claims 6 months ago, backdating them and claiming they supersede everyone else's boundaries. Can they do that?" Catherine asked, bouncing a fussy Emma on her hip as they stood in the yard. Jeff shook his head. "Not legally, no, But they've got money for lawyers, and they know most small ranchers don't. They're counting on people giving up rather than fighting a costly legal battle. Vince's expression hardened. They don't know this valley very well then. We don't give up our homes without a fight. The battle shifted from physical confrontation to legal maneuvering, with Dr. Wilson and Marshall Crawford working to expose the fraudulent nature of the Harkers' claims. Progress was slow, with papers going back and forth to the territorial capital and responses taking weeks to arrive. Meanwhile, spring turned to early summer. Emma took her first tottering steps across the cabin floor, falling into Catherine's waiting arms with a squeal of triumph. The garden behind the cabin flourished under Catherine's care, providing fresh vegetables for their table. Vince's horses thrived, with several new foals adding to their numbers. Despite the ongoing conflict with the Harkers, life continued its forward momentum. Catherine and Vince settled deeper into their marriage, their initial tentative hope evolving into a solid partnership built on mutual respect and deepening love. They spoke often of their past lives, of Thomas, of Sarah, and Lily, finding healing in shared memories rather than pain in remembered loss. And then, on a warm June morning, Catherine discovered news that changed everything. She had been feeling unwell for several days, tired beyond the usual demands of caring for an active toddler and helping with ranch chores, nauseated in the mornings, certain foods suddenly unpalatable. The signs were familiar, though it had been nearly 2 years since she had experienced them with Emma. When she was certain, she waited for the right moment to tell Vince. It came that evening. After Emma had been put to bed in the small room, Vince had added onto the cabin during the winter months, no longer a baby needing a cradle beside their bed, but a growing child with a space of her own. They sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. Vince's arm was around Catherine's shoulders, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "I have something to tell you," she began, her heart beating rapidly with anticipation. Vince turned to look at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby," Catherine said, the words sending a thrill through her even as she spoke them. "Our baby, in about 7 months if I've calculated correctly." For a moment Vince sat perfectly still, his expression frozen in shock. Then slowly wonder spread across his features, followed by a joy so pure it transformed him. "A baby," he whispered. "You're certain?" Catherine nodded, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "Yes. I've been feeling the signs for weeks now." Vince gathered her into his arms, holding her with infinite gentleness despite the strength of his emotion. "Catherine," he breathed against her hair, "a child, our child." The awe in his voice was unmistakable, a man who had lost so much, now given an unexpected gift. When he pulled back to look at her, Catherine saw tears glistening in his eyes. "Are you happy?" she asked softly, though the answer was written clearly on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Vince replied, his voice rough with emotion. He placed a reverent hand on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "A new life, a future." "A future," Catherine agreed, covering his hand with her own, "for all of us." The news of their coming child added urgency to resolving the conflict with the Harkers. What had been a principled fight for justice and property rights became something more personal, securing not just their present home, but their family's future. Word came in late July that Marshall Crawford had presented evidence of the Harkers' fraudulent claims to the territorial governor. The falsified documents would be invalidated, legitimate property boundaries upheld. It seemed victory was within reach. Then, on a sweltering August afternoon, Catherine saw smoke rising from the direction of the Wilson Ranch. Vince had ridden out that morning to help Jeff repair a windmill, leaving Catherine and Emma at home with strict instructions to bar the door if any strangers approached. From the cabin's porch, Catherine stared at the dark column of smoke with growing horror, one hand resting protectively on her slightly rounded belly, the other clutching Emma's small hand. "Mama, what's that?" Emma asked, pointing at the smoke with childish curiosity. "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine replied, though fear clawed at her throat. "Let's go inside." She had just barred the door when she heard horses approaching at a gallop. Grabbing the shotgun from its place by the door, Catherine positioned herself at the window, ready to defend her home and child if necessary. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Vince's chestnut gelding, though it was quickly replaced by fresh alarm at the sight of Jeff Wilson slumped in the saddle behind him, his shirt darkened with what appeared to be blood. Catherine unbarred the door and rushed outside as Vince pulled up in the yard. "What happened?" she cried, helping to support Jeff as Vince eased him down from the horse. "Harkers," Vince bit out, his face grim with fury and concern. "Set fire to the Wilson place. Shot Jeff when he tried to stop them." "Doc Wilson, Martha," Catherine asked as they helped Jeff into the cabin. "Got out in time," Jeff managed through gritted teeth. "Pa's gathering men from town, Martha's with the Hendersons." Catherine quickly cleared the table, and they laid Jeff upon it to examine his wound. The bullet had passed through his left shoulder, painful, but not immediately life-threatening if they could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to play quietly in your room for a little while," Catherine instructed, leading the wide-eyed toddler to her small bedroom. "Mama and Papa need to help Mr. Wilson." Once Emma was settled with her toys, Catherine returned to help Vince tend to Jeff's injury. Years on a frontier ranch had given her practical experience with such wounds, though she had hoped never to need such skills again. "They've gone too far this time," Vince said as they worked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Burning property is one thing. Shooting a man in cold blood is another." "It wasn't just me," Jeff said weakly. "They were talking about coming here next, said they'd teach you the final lesson." Catherine's blood ran cold at the threat. "Vince," she began, but he was already moving toward the door. "I need to secure the livestock," he said. "Get the horses into the corral near the house where we can defend them, then we prepare for company." "I should go with you," Catherine protested. Vince shook his head firmly. "You need to stay here with Emma and Jeff. Keep the shotgun handy." His gaze dropped briefly to her midsection where their child grew. "I won't take long." After he left, Catherine finished bandaging Jeff's shoulder, then moved methodically through the cabin, checking ammunition, filling buckets with water in case of fire, securing shutters over windows. She worked with calm efficiency, pushing fear aside to focus on practical necessities. Emma watched from her doorway, unusually quiet, sensing the tension in the air. "Are bad men coming, Mama?" she asked, her small voice steady despite the seriousness of her question. Catherine knelt before her daughter, smoothing back her dark curls. "Some men might try to scare us," she said honestly. "But Papa and I won't let them hurt you. You remember the hiding place Papa showed you?" Emma nodded solemnly. Vince had built a small, concealed space beneath the floorboards of Emma's room ostensibly for storing valuables, but Catherine had always suspected he had other purposes in mind. "If Mama or Papa tells you to hide, that's where you go," Catherine instructed. "And you stay there, quiet as a mouse, until one of us comes to get you. Can you do that?" "Yes, Mama," Emma promised. Vince returned 30 minutes later, his expression grim but determined. "Horses are secured. I've barricaded the barn doors as best I could." He checked his rifle, then the pistol at his hip. "If they come, they'll likely wait until dark. Should we try to leave?" Catherine asked. "Head for town," Vince shook his head. "Too risky with Jeff wounded and Emma to protect. The road's too exposed, we'd be easy targets. Better to defend what we know." As evening approached, they prepared as best they could. Jeff insisted on sitting up, his injured arm in a sling but his right hand steady enough to hold a pistol. Catherine put Emma to bed with extra stories and promises that everything would be all right, though the child's solemn eyes suggested she understood more than her parents might wish. Darkness fell, bringing a tense silence broken only by night sounds: the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the corral. Catherine and Vince positioned themselves at opposite windows, watching the approaches to the cabin while Jeff guarded the rear. The attack, when it came, was preceded by the faintest sound of hoofbeats, muffled by cloth wrapped around the horse's feet. Vince tensed, raising his rifle. "They're coming," he whispered. North side, using the trees for cover. Catherine moved to Emma's room, gently waking the sleeping child. Time to hide, sweetheart, she murmured, helping Emma into the concealed space beneath the floorboards. Remember what we talked about. Stay quiet until Mama or Papa comes for you. Emma nodded bravely, clutching her rag doll to her chest. I love you, Mama. I love you too, my brave girl, Catherine replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead before closing the hidden door and replacing the rug that concealed it. When she returned to the main room, Vince was conferring quietly with Jeff. I count 5 riders, he said, likely all armed. They'll probably try to burn us out rather than risk a direct assault. We need to keep them from getting close enough to set fire to the cabin, Jeff agreed weakly. Catherine took her position at the window, shotgun ready. She was afraid for herself, for her unborn child, for Emma, for Vince, but beneath the fear ran a current of fierce determination. This was their home, their future. She would defend it with everything she had. The first shot came without warning, splintering the window frame inches from Vince's head. He ducked, then returned fire in the direction the shot had originated. Farrell, a voice called from the darkness. We don't want to kill a woman and child. Send them out and maybe you'll live through the night. Go to hell, Harker, Vince shouted back. You're trespassing on my property, laughter drifted through the night. Not for long, this land will be Harker land before sunrise, one way or another. The exchange was followed by a volley of shots, peppering the cabin's exterior. Catherine and Vince returned fire selectively, conserving ammunition, while Jeff guarded against anyone trying to approach from behind. For nearly an hour, the standoff continued, periodic exchanges of gunfire, threats called through the darkness, tents waiting in between. Then Catherine caught the acrid scent of smoke. Vince, she called urgently. I smell fire. He moved to her window, cursing under his breath as he saw the orange glow beginning to illuminate the night. They've set fire to the barn, he said grimly, trying to draw us out. The horses in the nearby corral grew agitated, whinnying in distress at the smell of smoke and sound of gunfire. Catherine knew how valuable they were, not just financially, but as Vince's life's work, animals he had bred and trained with careful dedication. We can't let them burn, she said, understanding what the loss would mean. Vince nodded, his expression torn between protecting his family and saving the horses he loved. I need to get them out of the corral and into the south pasture, he said, away from the fire. It's what they want, Jeff warned from his position, to divide our defenses. I know, Vince replied. But I can't let them burn. Catherine made a swift decision. I'll cover you from here, she said firmly. Jeff can watch the back, you free the horses. Vince looked at her for a long moment, love and pride mingling in his expression. Be careful, he said simply, you too. With a quick kiss, Vince slipped out the door into the darkness. Catherine immediately began firing at the shadows where she had seen movement, providing covering fire as Vince made his way to the corral. From her position, she could see him working to open the gate, speaking soothingly to the frightened animals. The horses streamed out, galloping away from the burning barn toward the safety of the open pasture. It happened so quickly, a muzzle flash from the darkness, Vince staggering, then dropping to one knee. Catherine's heart stopped in her chest, but before she could cry out, Vince was up again, returning fire as he retreated toward the cabin. More shots rang out, but these came from a new direction from the road leading to their property. Shouts of confusion rose from the Harker's men. It's the marshal, Jeff called from his window, and looks like half the town with him. Relief surged through Catherine as she recognized Marshal Crawford's voice calling for the Harkers to drop their weapons and surrender. The tide had turned with the arrival of reinforcements, townspeople, and neighboring ranchers who had rallied to defend one of their own. Vince made it back to the cabin, blood seeping from a wound in his upper arm, but otherwise intact. Catherine nearly collapsed with relief as she helped him inside, quickly binding the injury while the sounds of the confrontation continued outside. Seems your father's message got through, Vince said to Jeff with a weak smile. Good timing. Within 30 minutes, the shooting had stopped, Marshal Crawford's authoritative voice could be heard giving orders, and soon a knock came at the cabin door. Farrell, Mrs. Farrell. It's Marshal Crawford, it's over. The Harkers are in custody. Catherine helped Vince to the door, supporting him as he opened it to reveal the marshal standing on their porch, rifle in hand but pointed safely downward. You folks all right? Crawford asked, his keen eyes taking in Vince's bandaged arm and Jeff's more serious injury. We'll live, Vince replied. The Harkers got all 3 sons and the old man, Crawford confirmed with grim satisfaction, plus 2 of their hired guns. They'll be facing federal charges: arson, attempted murder, land fraud. They won't be troubling this valley again. A cheer went up from the gathered townspeople and ranchers who had accompanied the marshal. Catherine saw Dr. Wilson pushing through the crowd, medical bag in hand, Martha close behind him. Their expressions as they caught sight of Jeff, wounded but alive, moved Catherine deeply. I need to get Emma, she said suddenly, remembering their daughter hidden beneath the floorboards. Vince nodded, squeezing her hand before releasing it. Tell her it's safe now. The bad men are gone. As Catherine lifted the hidden door and helped Emma from her hiding place, she was struck by the simple truth of those words. The threat that had hung over them since her arrival in this harsh, beautiful land had finally been lifted. Their home was secure, their future open before them without the shadow of the Harkers looming over every decision. Emma, sleepy but alert, looked up at her mother with complete trust. Did Papa stop the bad men? Yes, sweetheart, Catherine replied, lifting her daughter into her arms. Papa and our friends, the bad men can't hurt us anymore. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed. The barn was a total loss, but the cabin remained intact, and all the horses had been safely recovered from the south pasture. Dr. Wilson had tended to both Jeff and Vince, pronouncing neither wound life-threatening with proper care. The community rallied around them in the days that followed. Men from neighboring ranches came to help clear away the burned remains of the barn and begin construction on a new one. Women arrived with food, medicine, and offers to watch Emma while Catherine tended to Vince's injury. This is what makes the West worth fighting for, Vince remarked as they sat on their porch a week after the attack, watching a dozen men raising the frame of their new barn. Not the land or the cattle or even the freedom. It's this people standing together, helping each other through the hard times. Catherine leaned against his uninjured side, her hand resting on her growing belly where their child moved beneath her palm. I never imagined finding this when I set out from Tucson, she admitted. I was just trying to survive, to find safety for Emma. And I never imagined finding you, Vince replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. A woman carrying a child through the desert, half dead from thirst but still fighting. How could I not fall in love with such courage? The October day when their son was born dawned clear and cool, with the aspens on the distant hillsides turned to gold. Dr. Wilson arrived in time to assist with the delivery, though Catherine, having been through childbirth before, needed little help beyond moral support and an experienced hand. Vince paced outside until Martha Wilson emerged to announce he had a healthy son and that Catherine was doing well. He entered their bedroom with reverence, his eyes wide with wonder as he beheld his wife cradling their newborn. He's perfect, Vince whispered, carefully sitting beside Catherine on the bed. Just perfect. Emma, allowed in to meet her brother under Martha's watchful eye, climbed up beside them, her expression solemn as she studied the tiny red face. He's very small, she observed critically. So were you once, Catherine reminded her with a smile, but he'll grow just as you have. What will you name him? Martha asked from the doorway. Catherine and Vince exchanged a look of perfect understanding. They had discussed names during the long months of waiting, agreeing almost immediately on what felt right to both of them. Thomas, Vince said, honoring the man whose love had given him Catherine and Emma. Thomas Vincent Farrell. A fine name, Doctor. Wilson approved from where he stood packing his medical bag. A name with history. And future, Catherine added softly, looking from her newborn son to her husband to her daughter. A very bright future. 5 years later, Catherine stood on that same porch, watching as Vince taught 6-year-old Emma to ride her own pony, a beautiful paint named Starlight that had been her birthday present. 4-year-old Thomas ran circles around them, impatient for his turn, while 2-year-old Sarah picked wildflowers nearby under the watchful eye of Martha Wilson, who had become like a grandmother to all 3 children. The ranch had prospered in the years following the Harkers' defeat. With the valley's water rights secure and legal boundaries firmly established, ranchers had been able to focus on building rather than defending. Vince's horse breeding operation had expanded, earning a reputation throughout the territory for quality stock. The cabin, too, had grown, additional rooms added as their family expanded, a second story built the previous summer to accommodate their growing children. It was still modest by some standards, but to Catherine, it was a palace compared to what she had once feared would be her fate. She placed a hand on her belly, where the newest Farrell was just beginning to make his or her presence known. They hadn't told the children yet, wanting to be certain all was well before introducing the idea of another sibling. Vince looked up from adjusting Emma's stirrups, catching Catherine's eye across the yard. His smile, so much more frequent now than when she had first known him, still had the power to warm her from within. He excused himself and walked toward her, his limp from an old riding injury barely noticeable these days. "Everything all right?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to join her. "Perfect," Catherine assured him, leaning into his embrace as his arms circled her waist. "I was just thinking about how far we've come." Vince followed her gaze to their children, Emma confidently guiding her pony in a small circle, Thomas chattering excitedly about his turn, little Sarah with her fistful of wildflowers. "From that day in the desert," he murmured, "when I thought I was just offering water and rest to a woman and child in need. And instead found a family," Catherine finished, turning in his arms to face him. "The best kind of unexpected journey," Vince agreed, bending to kiss her softly. "From survival to living, from grief to joy." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Catherine thought of all the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment, the losses and gains, the pain and healing, the desperate journey through desert dust that had led to this man, this love, this life. "I wouldn't change a single step of it," she said softly, meeting Vince's gaze with absolute certainty. "Not one." "Neither would I," Vince replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Not one single step that brought you and Emma to me that day." Together they turned to watch their children, their ranch, their life unfolding before them, a future neither could have imagined in their darkest moments, yet one they had built together from the ashes of what came before. And as day faded gently into dusk, Catherine knew with bone-deep certainty that they would face whatever came next as they had faced everything since that fateful day in the desert together. Step by step, building a life of meaning and joy from the unlikely beginnings of a woman carrying a child through desert dust, and a cowboy offering water and a place to rest.